So I'm just going to offer a brief introduction to myself, and then I want to turn it to Scott. So I'm Sherry LaLiberte. I've had the privilege of working with a few of you on the line tonight, and perhaps to start off by sharing that the Vancouver Health for All Network is a volunteer initiative that was birthed out of the Health Promotion BC yearly forum. I can see Leslie Dyke on the line right now. It's great to see you. And that is a network of inter-sectoral health and social service providers. We've been working to develop a series of platforms from Leslie and Irv Rootman's initial lead in that work, both at the provincial and at the federal level with Health Promotion Canada. And so we do have a LinkedIn page. We have all of the platforms and the ways to link into that work in the Eventbrite ads. So I'll refer everyone to those links if you'd like to link in. Vancouver Health for All Network is a local networking group meant to support health social service workers, Indigenous members of our community, and diverse members, whoever is interested in joining and exploring specifically ways to address the social determinants of health and how health and social service providers can align our work in ways that support community organizing and policy advocacy that's oriented to addressing the determinants of health. So we're using that platform to host we have hosted a variety of talks so far. And if any of you have a topic or area of work that you're engaged in that you would like to share, we're happy to help host you and videotape it. We have a YouTube channel that we've created through the Health Promotion BC platform. So I'm Sherry LaLiberte. I am on faculty in the nursing program at Vancouver Community College. I'm here primarily through my background as a child and youth mental health nurse, trained in family therapy, and from what I have witnessed in that work around the impact of poverty and social and economic injustices within our communities and the impacts on children's families' lives. I came to this work through that in huge part, and then also through my work facilitating a population health practicum at VCC. And I've had the privilege of meeting both Scott and David through that work, initially through Scott and Our Place, and then through Our Place's work being linked to Exchange Intercity, which I'll leave it to them to share more about that history. So I want to also acknowledge that we're on the unceded stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. And I'm very honored to be turning it over initially to Scott. He'll be sharing some of his insights and views on work around decolonizing our economy, and then we'll come back to myself, and then I'll introduce David LePage, who I'm also really honored to be hosting tonight to share about his work in the area of social procurement and by Social Canada more broadly in supporting social enterprise within our communities. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Scott. Scott's the Executive Director of Aboriginal Life and Vancouver Enhancement Society, also founder of that nonprofit, also founder and member of the North West Indigenous Council and a representative with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. And I'll turn it to you, Scott, to introduce yourself in more detail.
Thank you, Sherry, and welcome to the folks that have joined this evening on this forum that's being organized. As Sherry said, I have a number of roles that I do on behalf of off-reserve Indigenous peoples here in Vancouver, provincially and federally. And a lot of the work that I do is really how do we advocate and build new relations with all levels of government and non-Indigenous institutions and non-Indigenous folks. I had a really difficult time trying to come to terms with what type of presentation I could do as it relates to procurement. And I really had a difficult time with that over the last little while. And trying to figure out how do I share with you the needs and aspirations as a Coast Salish citizen, of which I am, in light of the ongoing colonial exercise that both the mainstream media and government would not like us to see or know about or talk about. And so with that, I worked with a couple of young folks today, and I came up with this PowerPoint presentation. Most folks don't realize I've been doing this work for over 35 years at these different levels. And I'm often amazed. I mean, I shouldn't be after all these years, but the large degree of ignorance that folks have around Indigenous peoples, on reserve, off reserve status, non-status Métis, band councils, First Nations, nonprofit organizations, service, so forth. Most folks don't really understand where we come from as Indigenous peoples or as Indigenous citizens of Indigenous nations. And so I wanted to start this presentation off with you folks to show you a map, a fairly relatively decent map. Every map you ever get around Indigenous folks is contentious, but this is a good map of the Coast Salish nation. And when you look at this map, you'll see that we have 21 distinct dialects that make up the Coast Salish nation. 21 dialects. That's just Coast Salish. We're on both sides of the border. My ancestors regularly traveled and worked across on the American side, picking berries, hops, villages on both sides of the border and amongst the different areas. That's how our folks used to live. And and of course, colonialism has had an impact on that. Another thing most folks don't know about the Coast Salish is that we're one of 32 Indigenous nations in what we now call British Columbia. There's 32 distinct Indigenous nations in what we now call British Columbia. Here I'm showcasing the Coast Salish, but we have the Nuu-chah-nulth, we have the Haisla, the Tlinkits, the Tahlkans, the Dene, the Kanakas. There's 32 of these or tribal linguistic groups that by design of both the federal and provincial government deliberately in the early history of the makeup of this province and this country decided that they wanted to organize us by villages as opposed to tribal nations. And so this is the ongoing legacy that we see with all levels of government, mass media, and often the dialogue we have around this concept, First Nations. It's a highly colonial concept that I think we all need to be able to really sit back, do some research, and look at what we're really talking about when we talk about First Nations band councils and tribal nations founded on language and place. And so this is a nice little map that lays that out for you. The other thing is that if you look at how Canadian and American society has settled in our territories, you'll see that both Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, Tacoma, very large urban centers have been created in these areas for virtually the same reasons that we had this territory, was it was so rich in everything that to meet our needs and the needs of our family and our communities and our nations. So that's where I start from. That's my nation that was deliberately destroyed through and continuing to be destroyed by the colonial exercise. Moving to slide 2. And I'm getting a little worried here, Sherry. I just got an internet interruption thing, so I hope I don't lose you. Some key concepts in our dates in the colonial relationship between what we now call Canada and Indigenous peoples and nations is the 1763 Royal Proclamation by King George, which recognizes Aboriginal title and rights. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was put in Canada's original British North America Act when Canada repatriated its constitution in 1982. The Royal Proclamation is still part of Canada's new constitution. It's a document that we rely on consistently because in order for Canada to get access to our lands and our resources, or anyone to get access to our lands and our resources, they must have a treaty with us. They must have an agreement with us. It's Canadian. It's now in Canadian law. It is what is the sort of the benchmark for our rights, our title as Indigenous nations and Indigenous citizens. In 1846, the Oregon Treaty established the 49th parallel between US and the British boundary. So in 1846, they put this 49th parallel and they cut the Coast Salish Nation literally in half. Today, we have about 56, 58 Indian Act First Nation band councils in Canada, BC. And then we have about 56, 58 Bureau of Indian Affairs, like similar things down on the American side. So literally the Coast Salish Nation has been split in half. And within that, we probably number about 200,000 people, about no, about 360,000, I think, 180,000 on the Canadian side, and about the same on the American side. Most folks, again, don't realize that in 1850 to 1855, Chief Factor James Douglas did 14 Douglas treaties, because at the time when they were trying to settle the area for sending the folks up north for the gold mining and whatever they were doing up that way, they needed to conclude some type of agreements. Those treaties were recognized as treaties in the Supreme Court of Canada. And again, this is something that the federal government has not honored to this day. I am a Douglas Treaty descendant from southern Vancouver Island. My great-great-grandfather was a signatory to the treaties. And of course, we're not holding our breath for any government to live up to those treaties, but it teaches you how to, proceed cautiously with any of these governments. Of course, Canada became a country in 1867. If you read Canada's Constitution Act in 9124, it explicitly states that Canada has a responsibility for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. 9124, Indians and lands reserved for Indians. The federal government's take on that doesn't matter if it's a Liberal Party or a Conservative Party, and if an NDP ever got in there, it'd be the same thing. They've always minimized that fiduciary responsibility to status Indians living on reservations, which is only 20% of our people. So who's responsible for that other 80%? And if both levels of government are saying, I'm not responsible, you're responsible, what happens to that very large population? 1871, BC enters Confederation. The colonies united earlier than that, but at the time that BC entered Confederation, the Indians remain the responsibility of the federal government. Federal government is always saying we're only responsible for status Indians living on reserve. The other ones are the provincial government. Provincial government always says, no, they're not ours, they're yours. And so when you look at the legacy of colonialism, you look at all the determinants of health, and you see these patterns that are persisting and getting worse, and you got a federal government that says, no, they're not mine. You got a provincial government that says, no, they're not mine. They dump us on the cities. Cities only get 8 cents of our tax dollar. The rest of 50% of that goes to the feds. The other 42% goes to the province, and the 8 cents goes to the city. And so we, as urban Indigenous peoples, become beggars of the extreme notion in order to get our issues addressed with our own resources. We pay taxes, we do all that stuff, but we don't. There's a major ongoing neo-colonial exercise that most Canadians have very little clue. 1886, the year that city of Vancouver, which has the largest Indigenous population in British Columbia, the third largest population in Canada, live in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver area. It's well over 65,000 Indigenous peoples from all different nations that now call Coast Salish territory, Vancouver, Surrey, Burnaby, and so forth, home. But here we are still stuck in this conundrum between the federal government's unwillingness to recognize its fiduciary responsibility to us as Indigenous peoples living in this case, what we now call, the new term is off reserves. These are new concepts: on reserve, off reserve, obviously as a result of the Indian Act and them creating reservations, which should have been in my PowerPoint for 1876, I think is when the Indian Act was created. I end this slide with the 1928 Bartholomew Plan. Now, I've spent a lot of time, more time than I wish to think about, trying to work with the city of Vancouver through its downtown east side local area planning process. I gave 2.5 years of my life to that planning process. I worked another year on the Grandview Woodland Citizens Assembly local area plan, a tremendous amount of effort. But when you understand the history of colonialism for Indigenous peoples, urban Indigenous peoples, we go back to the Bartholomew Plan as the plan that keep the Indians out of sight and out of mind, i.e., put them in the low income areas where the land isn't worth very much, buy a bunch of social housing, load them in there. That's why you see so many of our folks living in the downtown east side or in the east side of Vancouver. That was a deliberate plan by the planners back in 1928 to 2021. This exists today. We continue to challenge them. Why are you continuously building social housing when you do build them in the downtown east side? We call that another form of neo-colonialism. It's implemented every day, and we can trace that back to the Bartholomew Plan of 1928. We do know that the city of Vancouver, prior to the pandemic, was implementing a city planning process for the first time in Vancouver's history. And of course, that's been interrupted by the pandemic. If I could get to the next slide, please. Social determinants of colonialism. What the heck is that? It's a new term. We just made it up in my office this morning. I built this presentation with 2 youth. Social determinants of colonialism. These are general statistics, but they're pretty damn good. 40% of the homeless population are urban Indigenous peoples, disproportionately young people. And of course, more and more elders and more women are joining the men in the streets, living in places like Strathcona Park, in Grandview Woodlands, in the schools and in the parks all around us. We have a crisis, a housing crisis, and disproportionately Indigenous folks are there. 62% of Indigenous, or 62% of children in care in quotes by the Ministry of Child and Family Development and its service agencies, and those include delegated Aboriginal agencies, are Indigenous children. We have more of our children in quotes in care today, end quote, than we did at the height of the residential schools. Like, how is that possible? 62% of the children in care are Indigenous youth. How is that possible? I've been working this file for a long time. Things are getting worse for urban Indigenous peoples, and a lot of this can be equated back to the federal government refusing to recognize its fiduciary responsibility to that 80% of the population living off reserves. Over 50% plus of the missing and murdered women and girls are Indigenous. We just spent $95 million to pay all these commissioners to run all over the country and hire a whole bunch of lawyers to tell us everything we already know. A year and a half ago, and they produced their report with 231 recommendations, and the federal government and provincial government and civic government have refused to respond in a coordinated, integrated fashion to reduce the large number of our folks that are dying in these ghettos, in the highways to Tears up north. And this we had a woman. I live and breathe the downtown east side every day. I hear the stories of women, our women being tortured like for 15 hours, sexually, physically abused right here in the city of Vancouver. This was a couple months ago. 40% of the Indigenous students here in the Vancouver School Board, they don't graduate. Now, they like to say that these kids drop out. They don't drop out. This is systemic, and therefore they're pushed out of the school system. That's what it is in 2021. Most recent statistics from Vancouver Coastal Health was that 17% of the opiate deaths here in Vancouver Coastal region are Indigenous peoples. 17%. That's not including all the opiate overdoses. And this 17%, I suspect, is quite low. We know that 30% of the Indigenous population live in poverty. We don't have any numbers for the pandemic. That's a good question. Why are there no numbers on urban Indigenous peoples that are impacted by the pandemic? Why is the federal government and the provincial government and the health authorities not rigorously gathering that data, and then two, sharing that data? And then, of course, all of this, as we look at the social determinants of colonialism, is we recognize that in Vancouver, 2% of the population are Indigenous. Now, these are earth-shattering statistics. This is stuff that we live with every day. I see it every day. It's around me, and it doesn't go on holiday. It doesn't take a break. The pain, the suffering mounts month by month, year by year. They're aware of it. The feds are aware of it. The province is aware of it. And the city is aware of it. What are they going to do about it? Next slide, please. We have come, I call it the struggle. And we as Indigenous peoples across this country have been fighting the colonial state and continue to do so. And we've won so many court cases at the Supreme Court of Canada. I don't even know what the numbers are. It's one thing to win the decision. It's entirely another thing to get it implemented by the state, by the province, by the city. It's like, who are you waiting for to do something? How many more of our people have to die unnecessarily because you, levels of government, refuse to recognize that what our relationship is to our lands, to our peoples, to our nation, and what you can continue to do to undermine our nationhood and citizenship. The Daniels decision I want to talk a little bit about, and I think I'm on time. The Daniels decision was a 17-year court case launched by Harry Daniels of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, our national advocacy organization for off-reserve Indigenous peoples. 17 years later, 2016, finally the Supreme Court of Canada came out and said that the federal government has the fiduciary responsibility for status Indians, non-status Indians, and Métis people. It was that simple. The federal government's responsibility. 2016, 5 years ago. What have they done? I won't get, we can do a whole presentation on that one. Virtually nothing. Colton decision of 2014, landmark decision in Canada, and I would suggest worldwide. It's the first time the Supreme Court of Canada, and I think any Supreme Court anywhere, recognized Aboriginal title, the original title to the territories. Unceded, never defeated, never given. Treaties across this country that have never been honored, including the one where I come from. The Marshall decision, 1999, Supreme Court of Canada. You will remember a few months ago back east where the Mi'kmaq fishermen and women were going out to get lobster and for food and ceremonial and for selling. And then the non-Indigenous population called, racism or whatever they call it, and tried to block them. They started destroying their nets, destroying their buildings and all these nasty things. Well, this was 1999. This is 2021. So that's what, 22 years later. And the federal government has still not stepped up and honored that decision. The Corbière decision of 1999. We were not allowed to vote for our chief and council until we took the Canada to the Supreme Court and finally won that case in 1999. Off-reserve Indigenous status Indians like myself have virtually no say on pipelines. None, actually. We have no say on development because band councils, whether they want to recognize it or not, are accountable to the Department of Indian Affairs, which they now call Crown Indigenous Relations Northern Affairs. Band councils, like service providers, are accountable to government. That's where they get their money from. They're not accountable to peoples. Delgamuth, I'll just throw that one in there because Delgamuth came up recently as well. And I want to talk about the TMX, it wasn't the TMX pipeline, it was the other pipelines up in Wet'suwet'en territory. You will remember, if you can, with the crazy life we've all been living prior to the pandemic, this country was shut down in January. Indigenous peoples and allies were blocking highways and railways and every which way you could and literally shut this country down because the federal government is trying to run a pipeline through the Wet'suwet'en territory. Well, and they turned around and said, we got the support of the chiefs. The chiefs said we could put a pipeline through their territories. That's what they said. And it was the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, Stuart Phillip, who recently came out and he said, hey, listen, Indian Act band councils have no authority beyond the boundary of the reservation. Therefore, the chiefs, Indian Act chiefs, do not have the authority to give you permission to put pipelines through their territory. So then the clans chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en, the houses up there, they were the ones who have the authority. And that's what Delgamuth says. Delgamuth says that it's the hereditary, I'll use the word hereditary chiefs, that's not the word they use, but that's the word Canadians use. They're the ones with the authority on decision making. And so the federal government sat at the table with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and then said, okay, we will consult with you on this particular initiative. That was a big area of movement away from Indian Act band councils towards our traditional tribal governments. Next slide, please. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a brilliant document that was worked on by a whole bunch of brilliant folks for many decades. Canada, right now, as I speak to you, is in the process of trying to pass this in the House and turn it into Canadian law. Again, 80% of Indigenous peoples live off reservations. Again, we haven't been consulted. No one's asked us what we think about UNDRIP or this version of UNDRIP that Canada is going to look to adopt in the next little while, could be in the next couple months. I think it's Bill C-15. Again, very little consultation, none, virtually no consultation with that 80% of folks living off reserve. And I would strongly suggest there's been very little consultation with the status Indians living on reservations. At any rate, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a starting point. It's a baseline. It's the beginning. And Canada is going to do everything it can to water it down so that it comes under Section 35 of its constitution, which would regulate us to municipal style entities with fee simple title and all the beauties of capitalism that they've been forever trying to assimilate us into. So this is another battle that we have as Indigenous peoples, but very important in UNDRIP, which the city of Vancouver was the first city in North America to adopt, by the way, in 2014. It says, Article 3, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of the right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. That's really loaded. But as a Coast Salish citizen, with UNDRIP, we have the right to define our political entities that we choose to participate in to advance and exercise our inherent right to self-determination. That's what this means. And I will share with you that the province did adopt their version of UNDRIP, Bill 41, I think it was, about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And I will tell you that this so-called progressive NDP government, because they're supposed to be progressives, they don't engage that 80% of Indigenous people living off reserves either. They own that. That's real. And I was really disappointed because we had, at that time, 4 sitting Indigenous MLAs, and not one of them that are part of the governing system had the ability to advocate for the stuff I'm sharing with you. Next slide, please. I think we have the toughest job. As far as Indigenous peoples are concerned, Indigenous peoples living off the reservations, I firmly believe we have the most difficult job to advocate for our people. The governments don't want to hear from us. They don't. Feds, the province, the city of Vancouver, Parks Board. They want to play the narrative that these band council chiefs represent everything, and our interests included. And they don't, and they know they don't. They use our numbers to get a whole bunch of money. So does the province. It doesn't come back to us. So we've been working in my work at Alive, Aboriginal Life in Vancouver Enhancement Society. We were able to get some funding to put together 10 Indigenous youth, 10 non-Indigenous youth. We consulted with over 2,000 youth in East Vancouver. We held many workshops. We held a big conference on policy items that these young folks wanted to see happen in East Vancouver. And the key thing, and this document I understand will be made available to the folks online, as well as when this document goes on forward, is you can read the document for yourself. It's a really solid document and it goes into a bit more detail. But ultimately, no matter what we're talking about when it comes to the social determinants of health, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, governance and good governance makes a big difference on the outcomes for people and for places. The downtown east side was deliberately created the way it is. Carousdale was created deliberately the way it is. British properties, and so forth and so forth. That's what we call systemic colonialism. Now, the key message in that policy document is when we're talking about urban Indigenous self-government, honoring Coast Salish Nation, we're talking about building good relationships with mutual respect. There is no respect right now with these governments because they want to see us gone. I call us ghost Indians. They've ghosted us. We're there, but we're not there. Self-determination by Indigenous peoples, that's our goal based on our nations, tribal nations. Equal voices in the decision-making process. It's very interesting how federal, provincial, civic, parks board, and school board, when they want to talk to urban Indigenous, when they want to claim to have urban Indigenous engagement, they'll go to a service provider. I'll say the Friendship Center, maybe not the Friendship Center, but I'll just say the Friendship Center as an example. They go talk to them and then they walk away, they tick their box, and then they go do whatever it is that they're going to do and drive their policy through. Could you imagine if Canadians as a whole, the federal or any of these governments said, oh, we consulted with you because we went and talked to the YWCA or a neighborhood house or whatever. They don't consult us. There is no free, prior, informed consent from Indigenous peoples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, not the UN Declaration.
Okay, so it looks like we may have lost Scott. So just invite a few moments of patience here.
The comprehend. Now this is really important because this is where David's going to take us. What we need is a comprehensive, mutually developed implementation strategies. One will be procurement, another will be housing, another will be child welfare, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And this is the work. This document is going before, it has already every MLP, every MP, every chief, every organization. This is a solid document. I encourage people to review it. And very, very important, and I think most folks on the line would agree with this, is that we really want evidence-based decision making. What's going to work? I don't think that's asking too much. What's going to work to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples? Not asking for the whole thing. We'll get there eventually. Next generations will take off that. But why can't we have the same graduation rates as non-Indigenous? As a small example. Next slide. Well, this was a tough one because I wouldn't be fair to our people and to similar-minded other folks. Before the pandemic happened, I think it was February-ish, we started to hear about it. In March, it started to take off. But I said earlier, it was in January, in December, with the Wet'suwet'en, the pipelines, the Indian Act chiefs versus the clan chiefs. They shut the country down. The statement coming out of the young people that occupied the provincial legislative buildings for, I don't know how long they were there, 2 or 3 weeks, was reconciliation is dead. All right. And then you heard a few of these politicians that said, oh, no, reconciliation's not dead. Yeah. Show me the proof that you guys have actually shared resources and shared decision-making authority. The common thread on this particular screen, government controls the decision-making. They control the resources. They are stingy to share that. They think that they debate amongst themselves who has jurisdiction over our children. Well, neither the feds or the province have jurisdiction over it. We have jurisdiction over our children. Your colonial systems are the ones that are increasingly putting our kids into the child welfare system, which leads to the homeless population, which leads to the incarceration, which leads to suicide and all that nasty stuff that, that we see. And it's not going to change in the near future either. When 80% of the people live off reservations and they're not engaged and governments are trying to ghost them out of existence, how the hell are you going to get change, positive change? In every category, I don't know one, well, maybe post-secondary or maybe high school graduation rates, things are getting worse. In 2001, 1/3 of the children in care in British Columbia were Indigenous. In 2021, 62% of children in care are Indigenous. It is what it is. Vancouver called itself the City of Reconciliation in 2014. They brag about 70,000 people walking in the rain in celebration of reconciliation. Well, I will remind you folks that around December or November, I don't know the exact date, the mayor's Urban Aboriginal Peoples Advisory Committee wrote a letter to the mayor saying that we're done. We're fed up with your fake reconciliation. We want real change. And ultimately, it comes down to two things: decision-making and resources, and they won't share them. Next slide, please. Oh, this is where I go, Haichka. I put my hands up for you folks for hearing all the stuff I had to share with you. I feel good about this presentation because it keeps me true to my principles. People like Sherry and David are strong allies for meaningful reconciliation. And I just want to put my hands up. Haichka OCM, thank you for hearing my words.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. I have to say, I'm very grateful that I have a few of our students on the line in hearing this history too. It's something that we're really aiming to integrate into our nursing program at VCC and grounding it in this the sovereigntist decolonizing perspective that you've so powerfully shared tonight. So thank you so much for that. So thank you again, and very, very grateful. And through Scott, I had the privilege of meeting David LePage, who is here on the line with us, and he is the managing partner of Bisocial Canada, and then also teaches. I just learned recently with the University of Fredericton in the MBA program in social enterprise leadership, and also is engaged in national international leadership within this realm of work. And I'm still learning myself. I'm very much looking forward to his presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to him. And feel free to share your screen, David, and to share your PowerPoint slide. And when David finishes, then I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can move into a dialogue and brainstorm how we can take these ideas forward into action.
So Scott, thanks. I don't know how to follow that, but I'll try. And Sherry, thank you for convening this, because I think this is a really pertinent conversation. And like Scott, I've been doing this a really long time and working in different areas around building healthy communities. And I thought that when Sherry asked to talk about economics for all, that's really a lot about, I think, where I've been trying to focus for a long time, because where I've come to now is that the marketplace is really such a critical component of whether or not we're going to have healthy communities. Because no matter whether we're consumers or we're businesses or we're universities, colleges, anchor institutions, hospitals, or government, we're always buying things. There is always this exchange of buying and selling goods, services, construction. And there's two parts to that equation. One of them is the demand side. And so those are all the people who do the buying. But there's also the supply side, the sellers. So the people who sell those products or those services, again, individuals, private businesses, co-ops, and social enterprises. So in my mind, the question is like, how do we take and try to look at this marketplace and use it to help build healthy communities? So I went back and I started to try to figure out, like, how does this work? And if you go back, and Scott's picked up so well on this, is if you go back a few thousand years, the indigenous model of trading was really around value for value. So there's actually now the historic findings of thousands of years ago, indigenous communities that were farming shellfish or drying salmon and trading with the First Nations and the first peoples who lived in the prairies. And they had maize and they had grains and they had buffalo. And then there were the people in the area that we now call Mexico and New Mexico that had gems and stones. And they were trading. And those gems and stones have been found in the areas we now call Quebec, because they were trading across communities and they were going community to community to create mutual value. And when we think about this, it's really the traditional indigenous community-based value of the marketplace that I think we have an awful lot to learn from. And I think it's where we have to go back and start to understand when we talk about
62717.
when we talk about the current marketplace, it really is the emergence of a Western economic model that came with colonization of this area called North America. So we went from this value creation model that was part of the Indigenous and First Peoples marketplace to the accumulation of personal wealth to be the ultimate goal. And in order to create that kind of personal wealth, you have to extract or exploit the supply chain. And then we actually started to create, and it's funny because, as Sherry said, I teach in an MBA program. and the most famous MBA or business school, University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, who said the only social responsibility of business was to make profit for shareholders. So if that's driving our economy, you're going to end up with a different kind of situation. So as a result of that marketplace we have, instead of creating community value, we're actually creating these persistent and complex social economic issues like the skills gaps and like homelessness and the issues that Scott was sharing with us is because in order to make this Western model marketplace work, you have to extract value from that supply chain or from labor. So then comes COVID, and COVID just really exposed to me and to I think everyone the real fragility of the social infrastructure. So all of a sudden now we've got an extreme exposure of the inequities between power and money and resources. And I think I'm so tired of hearing build back better, because if we just build back the same thing, we're going to have a terrible future. I really think we have to build back different. And when we think about building back different, I'd like to see us build a marketplace that's about building community capital, not about personal capital, not about accumulating economic capital, but creating community capital. So cultural capital. When we think about every time we work in the marketplace, are we actually recognizing the cultural, the diversity and respecting that? Are we respecting and building healthy physical capital? Are we creating jobs and training and education? Are we creating some fair and equitable economic capital? But also, are we creating social capital? Because social capital is that glue, those relationships in community. So if we think about the marketplace, that sharing of goods and services as a way not to just create economic transactions, but we actually think about it as a way to create community capital. And when I look at a marketplace that focuses on creating community capital, I look at a marketplace that's made up of three components. One of them is that our primary supplier is social enterprises. Our primary buying is through social procurement, and our financing is around building patient social value financing. So if we want to just look at this a little bit before we get into our discussion time, look at the supply side. And we're very lucky to be living in Vancouver. It's probably the largest center of social enterprises that I know anywhere internationally. There are 85 social enterprises in the inner city doing everything from catering to gifts to cleaning services to junk removal to making art to making jewelry to making chocolate to making coffee, all kinds of things. Social enterprise is a business, but it's a business that has a social, cultural, environmental goal. And it also reinvests the majority of any profits back into it. So social enterprise is the supply side in a social value marketplace. Because when we buy from social enterprises, we're creating value that builds community capital. We're not looking at the traditional charity model of just doing social good. We're not looking at the traditional business model of a financial return. We're looking at a blended value. So we're looking at both social and business together, not one or the other, but blended. And when we think about social enterprises, I can't think of any business that they're not addressing. Arts, retail. We think about the farmers markets bringing value, thrift stores, catering, car shares, any type of business, and also any type of community issue. We've got social enterprises that work on food security. We've got social enterprise creating jobs for people who face barriers. We have groups like Embers who are serving the construction industry with day labor. We have groups like Mission Possible, creating jobs and doing cleaning for people. So all kinds of businesses, all kinds of social issues. That's the supply side. So we create the social enterprises to provide the goods and services and the social outcomes. But one of the things we realized back in like 2002, 2003, working in the downtown east side, we really also had to work on the demand side, because only trying to create opportunities for people to get jobs through social enterprises, or only creating social enterprises, wasn't actually creating
Hi.
the change we wanted. We needed to create the demand side. So
Yeah,
the
I could use that.
demand side is social procurement. So this is how we use our existing procurement to create and leverage a social value. So social procurement, very simply, just leveraging a social value from existing procurement. So rather than focusing just on the cheapest thing, we start to look at best value for money spent. And when we think about best value, we think about community capital, not just the cheapest item. So lowest price is not always the best value. Best value is always about building community value. That doesn't mean it costs more. It doesn't mean it's less value. It's just a different perspective in how we evaluate the supplier. So what happens is that purchasing, whether it's by a consumer, an anchor institution, by government, by a business, it becomes a tool for community transformation, not merely a financial transaction. And this is a real culture shift. It's a real shift in how we understand the marketplace, because we have been trained in the last 400 years to say the marketplace is all about a financial transaction to extract value, to create economic value. Now we turn that around and we say, yes, we're still going to have a marketplace, but our marketplace is actually now going to become a means to build healthy communities, because we know we're always going to be trading goods and services, but we're going to now use that marketplace to actually create community value, not just create personal value. And so what happens, there's two primary channels. One is things we buy, and the other is the things we build. So when we buy things, we start to look at price, and we look at quality, we look at the environmental impact, and now we're looking at the social value as well. When we build things, we look at what are the community benefits that can be created every time we build something. Is it a new university building? Is it St. Paul's Hospital? Is it a new bridge? How can we use construction to create community opportunities? Because we know that every time we purchase or build something, we know there's an economic, an environmental, and a social impact. What we're saying, let's take those impacts and direct them to community creation. So when we think about how we buy, we want to think about prioritizing the social value suppliers. Can we find a social enterprise that can do this for us? If we can't find a social enterprise, can we find a local business? Can we find a business owned by women? Can we find a cooperative business? Anything we can do to create the greatest value is where we should look first when we buy things. And then we start to look out to make sure that we can create the value. So when we think about, if we're going to be doing reconciliation, if we're going to be recreating and decolonizing our relationship with First Nations and urban Indigenous communities, how are we using and selecting our suppliers to help solve that problem? Because if we're only doing the same thing we used to, we are continuing to create the same problems, instead of using this as a tool to create new communities. When we think about that, like the city of Vancouver has a community benefit policy, community benefit agreement policy. The new St. Paul's Hospital is going to be the first implementation of that. So that means that 10% of all the purchasing has to be local and social. Also, 10% of all the new hires have to come from historically underrepresented communities and marginalized communities. So, and this is not just during construction, this is the life of St. Paul's Hospital. So this is the next 50 years. We have great opportunities. Crown corporations, we look at like First and Clark is some new social housing going on. Well, the construction company, Shando's Construction, got the contract and went to BC Housing and said, look at, we're the developer, you're the owner. Why don't we, use this to do some community benefits? So there you have a voluntary community benefit agreement that's going to be working on social housing. So how can we use that to actually create greater benefits? Ottawa Housing and Manitoba Housing, both Crown corporations, are really clear about how they work with social enterprises. Manitoba Housing actually uses Build, a social enterprise that works primarily with urban Aboriginal youth to get them into the trades to fix up all the housing every time someone moves out. So it's a really, they are going to pay someone to do that. It has to be done. Let's use a social enterprise that helps us build community, build skills for young people. Anchor institutions. A couple of years ago, SFU realized that a lot of the people using their meeting space, they'd rather have a social enterprise or an Indigenous owned catering company. So SFU went through the effort to identify those social enterprises and Indigenous catering choices to add to their opportunities. So it's a simple kind of thing because people are going to buy the catering, they want to have the meetings. SFU actually creates greater value for their customers and creates the social value by allowing social enterprises and Indigenous catering companies to be part of that existing supply chain. And we get to private businesses, we're seeing an amazing explosion. SAP is a software company, international software company. They've made a commitment that 5% of their controllable purchasing by 2025 is going to come from social enterprises. This is millions and millions of dollars of opportunity. So how do we create that? How do we encourage that? And the same thing is they've started it like years ago. Since 2008, SAP has been buying catering from Potluck and Have in the downtown east side. So it's not like we're asking anyone to buy things they're not going to buy. We're not saying buy with less quality or pay more for it. We're just saying replace and be purposeful about how we can use our current buying to create greater value. On Vancouver Island, 23 rural and remote municipalities and regions are now working together. Everyone from Port Hardy to Victoria, Squamish, Tofino, they're saying we're small, but when we're together, we have millions and millions of dollars of building things, of building water treatment plants, of buying catering, of getting, landscaping done, of collecting garbage, all those things they're looking at. We're municipalities in rural communities, in Indigenous communities. We need to keep that money here. We need to use our taxpayer money to create the communities we want. In Toronto, there's 18 public sector groups, everything from Ryerson University, University of Toronto. All of them are public sector institutions that are working together to leverage procurement, hiring, and investment to do economic development because they know they're going to need these things, they're going to invest. How do they, as colleges, universities, get together and collaborate and really have an impact? Bisocial Canada, the organization I work with, we're a social enterprise, and our purpose is really to create this new marketplace. That's our whole purpose. We want to see a social value marketplace. So a lot of our materials are all free for downloads on our website. Lots of examples of how to do things, examples for requests for proposals, policies. We work with a lot of municipalities across the country with Edmonton, Wood Buffalo, Ottawa, Calgary. All of these municipalities, lots of organizations, they're changing how they buy things because they're realizing that they are going to be purchasing anyway. Why not purchase with community value instead of just an economic value? So if you want to find out more, you can go to our website at bisocialcanada.com. if you're really interested, I wrote a book last spring, The Marketplace Revolution, that you can purchase on our website. If you like it any way you want to read it or listen to it, it's there. So hope we have some time for some conversation, Sherry.